This meeting is being recorded.
Very automated. Okay, hello, welcome to Minor Compositions. And today we have a quite interesting live event and discussion where we are joined today by Penny Rosemont, Paul Buhle, Abigail Susik, and a whole bunch of interesting people with the idea that today we're going to discuss an interesting new collection of book published by PM Press. Um, Bringing together a lot of things which I think have already been published, some of which earlier versions by Charles H. Kerr and by Arsenal and probably a number of other places I can't remember off the top of my head. But the book Surrealism, Bugs Bunny, and the Blues, which collects together a bunch of Franklin Rosemont's really amazing writings on popular culture and the marvelous in everyday life, which is simply excellent. And maybe as a sort of like place to begin, and then we can just sort of have a sort of a free for all from there. Um, I think it's a really excellent collection because one of the things that I think is most interesting about things happening in Chicago is that, in the Chicago Surrealist group is the way that y'all brought together a labor politics and a cultural politics and an emphasis about like sort of the radicality of popular culture in everyday life. And I was joking to Jim the other day that in some ways you could almost say that like the Chicago Surrealists basically invented cultural studies without being credited as doing such. And I think it's a really sort of amazing moment of convergence of influences and histories that, in some ways, has been kind of, let's say, overlooked into the history of radical politics, but thankfully is now coming back into focus again. So I'd like to sort of maybe just start as a sort of, you know, um, contextualize sort of how all these things come together, where you get the sort of the mix of, radical politics of everyday avant-garde art history, labor politics. So how does that happen? Like, where does that come from? I will toss that out to anyone who wants to take a whack at it.
I just want to mention Franklin's book on Joe Hill because it's about 1,000 things, including Joe Hill. And looking at it in the last week, I came across his take on the Chicago literary renaissance of the 1920s, which was, in a way, the most prestigious. I wouldn't say it's the most important, but the most prestigious literary thing to happen in Chicago for a very long time. It was San Francisco, 1950s, 60, Greenwich Village, New York, 1910s, Chicago, 1920s. And he observes that Carl Sandburg, the early socialistic Carl Sandburg, among others, anticipated the Chicago Renaissance, but also says or suggests that Joe Hill anticipated Carl Sandburg. In other words, one of these interesting things that Franklin did was to make this connection between certain aspects of working class culture, sometimes in Chicago, and the wider, but especially better known and admittedly more elite cultural movements that connected with it. And to me, that was a very fine insight and opens up in various historical ways for those who are thinking about Chicago, the history of Chicago on the left, Chicago literary history, and so forth and so forth. A very different way to look at it. And I might say, without claiming I'm the one in this group that knows the most, that from Haymarket or earlier through Joe Hill, through the 20s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth, he was always or intermittently interested in pulling all these Chicago things together. I had an editor of the Beats and SBS and something else, my early comics after 2005. And he had heard that the Kerr Company was facing these new crises of production and distribution and so forth. And he said to me, it would be a very great shame to have the Kerr Company's list disappear because of the enormous contribution they'd made, among other things, to understanding Chicago's culture in the widest way and what significance that culture had for American culture and international culture at large. A lot more can be said about this, but that's very striking to me.
Hmm. I mean, that's quite interesting. One of the things I quite like about it, and I think the way Franklin and Penelope and other people from Chicago sort of approached reading and understanding popular culture was, if you read sort of like someone, let's say like Marcuse, for instance, or sort of a lot of critical theory, you end up with a version of like popular culture as sort of like distraction or sublimation or kind of like, a quite negative reading rather than a space for like the realization of desire and radical politics in a more in a sort of everyday sense.
I guess I like
Well,
to speak to
yeah,
this.
I guess.
But
Oh, me? Okay. Well, I mean, I'll mention Marcuse because that was very important to me when I wrote my book, and both Penny and Paul helped me understand that very complex debate, discussion that went on between the Chicago Surrealist group and Marcuse starting in 1970. And I believe, having read the letters on both sides, his letters to them and their letters to him, which the letters that the Surrealists wrote back to Marcuse haven't been published. They're still in the archive in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But I worked with them, and I actually believe that they succeeded in convincing Marcuse, or at least really kind of, I mean, I think there was an impasse in the argument but really kind of successfully at least debating with him that there is a form of especially proletarian or working class popular culture that is resistant, or it does evade the totalizing grasp of the culture industry, right? There's a way to escape that through worker solidarity, worker consciousness, and those kinds of things. And Franklin's favorite, one of his favorite examples, and Penny, you can expand on this if you want, is, like workplace sabotage, which was for Franklin a form of creativity. And some of that is reflected in the selections that we have of texts by Franklin that feature, of course, Americana, Chicagoana, and working class history. The favorite example of mine, of which in the political realm, is the sort of visual culture of the anarchist, which I don't know if you know that text, Stephen. It's like my favorite in the book, which kind of contrasts like dominant culture with what might be kind of other subcultural ideas of, let's say, the anarchist.
Yeah.
Well,
shall I speak, or did you want to go, Stephen?
No,
So,
go ahead, Penny.
oh, okay. Well, I do want you to recall that we were just blocks away from the IWW, and it was an IWW bookstore. And in fact, they had already incorporated cartoons and songs and poems in their critique of society. So it was new to bring in something as artsy as surrealism, but certainly trying to create a milieu. The IWW had already had that idea, and they had quite a substantial one before they were, of course, destroyed. And then we were anthropology students, and St. Clair Drake was an excellent teacher. Studs Terkel was writing books like Division Street. Slim Brundage had been out there and uniting songs, folk music, African Americans, Union people at his club. And we all were attracted to Chicago, my Nelson Algren's book, Chicago City on the Make, which combined sort of all of the aspects of Chicago into one long kind of prose poem. So we followed our own interests, basically. And I think that it was David Roediger who was responsible for the Joe Hill book, because Franklin had written a small book on Joe Hill, and David said, you should make this longer. And Franklin said, how can I make it longer? We can't find out any more information about these people. but there's a whole world out there that was Joe Hill's milieu. There were his friends, there was the IWW, there was the Times. And, often when I look back, I discover that people say, oh, something happened. And they don't realize that maybe it happened because of the flu situation right after the World War, or they don't realize it was the women's movement that had something to do with this. Or it's very interesting that when they banned alcohol in Chicago, the next year there was a cholera epidemic.
Mm.
Well, people couldn't drink beer, so they were drinking water, but the water was contaminated. So, putting together the various aspects of things and looking at them, I think was something perhaps it wasn't done in the US. But if you look at France, there's Ferdinand Braudel who was trying to do this. Of course, we were unaware of his history at that time, so he wasn't an influence. But I enjoy reading his books. So there was a lot of things out there. We just wrote about what we were interested in, and it was everything. And we had comics in our bookstore. We had books. We had City Lights books. We had science fiction books. We just filled it up with stuff everybody liked. Figured, yes, that'll be it.
Well, you just follow your passions and you see where they take you, right?
Yes.
But there's something quite interesting and I think quite special about the way of engaging the IWW, because for instance, it's both a labor union, but also very much a kind of cultural organizer itself, right? So for instance, if you look over to like, let's say, Italian autonomism in the 70s, you have the idea that go outside the factory, go to everyday life or organizing. Well, the IWW has been doing that for, by that point, already, what, 70, 80 years, right? So it's this,
From '05. They were organized in 1905, I believe. So
yeah.
they were around with that idea. And they had some
Even to
great
go back to your
cartoons.
early question about like how, excuse me, Penny, about how these two things to go together. I was wondering if Paul would tell the story of meeting Franklin and Penny in connection with Radical America, because Radical America for me was a place in which those two things coexisted in the late 60s and early 70s, pop culture and radical leftist politics as it was at the time in the United States. And so Paul's perspective is really interesting on that meeting and how the group integrated, the Chicago Surrealist group integrated with the journal, and then just these kind of the relationship with Franklin in particular at that time. And I know, Penny, you were there too, so it'd be so interesting to hear you two reminisce about that, or at least just mention the Radical America connection, because that's the place where you can find the concrete traces of these passions that you all had. I mean, Paul's passion for comics and popular culture is as magnanimous as Penny's is, and the group, the Solidarity Bookshop group in Chicago.
Let me try to describe this briefly, lucidly, if I can. There was only one quote unquote national editorial meeting of Radical America. It was in my backyard in Madison, and Franklin and Penny were on hand along with half a dozen other people, some of them coming from far distances, most others from Madison, which was a real hotbed of radicalism, cultural and political in those days. But that's probably 1970, so that the surrealism issue had already been published. I think we go really back to 1966, 1967, and Penny's right in referencing the bookstore, because it seems to me in 1966, I got in touch with Franklin about wanting something from the bookstore. Oddly enough, I think it was the mimeographed version of Notes on Dialectics by C.L.R. James, the most obscure James book imaginable, which someone had taken the determination to put this out in mimeograph form. And whether I got that book from him, I was in Champaign at the time, or not, I don't recall. But by 1967, I was publishing Radical America. And by the fall issue of 1967, it was publishing in Madison. And on the cover of that second issue was an IWW sticker, a very familiar Black Cat sabotage kind of thing, and an article by Fred Thompson, who was the General Secretary, Penny will correct me if I'm wrong, of the IWW, and somebody who kept a much smaller than before organization somehow going for a while longer, and was also the self-taught historian of the IWW, along with academic historians, but Fred had his own version, and it was a good version of it. So somewhere around 1967, 68, Radical America launched to be a journal for Students for Democratic Society, mostly read by graduate students in Students for Democratic Society, it must be said, and very frequently distributed by graduate students who worked in bookstores near campus, non-university affiliated bookstores, some affiliated, but they were the kinds of people, men and women, who liked to hang out, to make things available, and to chat with undergraduates, radicalized undergraduates, about broadening their ideas. That I think that was the basic milieu. Since I typed out the labels, address labels, the first year, I can almost remember what streets people lived on, from New York to Toronto to Chicago to San Francisco. Their names come back to me. But as the magazine grew, it became necessary, or I thought it was necessary, to take in more and more aspects of culture. It was more of a history magazine, but it was likewise a culture magazine. And it was very fortunate that Franklin contacted me. I mean, I think I must have exchanged hundreds of letters, many of them his letters, in the archive of Radical America at State Historical Society of Wisconsin, about whether this could be done, how it would be done. How it could be done was a big issue because we had to get each issue typeset at that time in the primitive fashion that we had, and an old movement activist, that is to say, someone who must have been over 30, agreed to typeset it, and afterwards said that he did a beautiful job. He didn't understand a single word of what he typeset, but he knew it was important. And so it appeared in 1969, and among other cultural issues, cultural-oriented special issues of Radical America at that time, it maybe has a analogous relationship to the issue of Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, which appeared the next year. But you could also say it has a relation with the special issue on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, and of the revolutionary Black poetry that the pages, thanks to context that we had, and to the very, very widely read poetry of D.A. Levy, a famous Cleveland character of the time, who committed suicide in 1970, but had an enormous impact, reading his poems in Cleveland, being arrested by the police, and so forth and so forth. So it's a wonderful, wonderful moment, like none others in my now long experience, of something exciting happening every week, if not every day, of sometimes coming home from demonstrations and turning on the television and seeing demonstrators in Prague or Paris looking very much like us, playing pretty much the same music, often the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, a sense of there being a universal push forward. And I'm suspecting that in each one of these places, there was an expectation, hope that it would be joined with the working class movement. And to the degree that happened, it happened temporarily, briefly. And none of us, I suspect, knew how big the hammer was that was coming down upon us. from the ruling parties in the world, also from the labor functionaries in the world, and that we had pretty nearly come to an end with the giant project. But for a while, it continued on and spurred our creativity to do various things, to think of various things to do. So, from a point of view of a publisher who lost money on every issue in those days, the surrealist issue was good because it got some people that hadn't thought much about culture but were interested in labor history, very, very interested, and to thinking hard. And I come across people to this day say, gosh, that was a great magazine. And that surrealism issue, I still have it at home, meaning they dragged it around through 8 changes of address. So it made a mark.
But then you can think about the kind of maybe a similar experience you have with Radical America as compared to what was happening with in Heatwave. Sorry, was it Heatwave in the UK?
A little early, right?
A little bit earlier?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, 66, yeah. 65, 66, I think. Or 60, yeah. It's Heatwave, only 2 issues.
I have an observation which might or might not be true. The anarchist sentiment within the Beat generation was at its best really interesting and articulated as anarchism. And there was an anarchist trend in the UK and the US in the early 1960s, but the movement became, the political movement that emerged was so ill-defined or self-defining that it didn't fit into communist, Trotskyist, socialist, or even wobbly, or any of those other things. And to the degree that anarchism had an influence, it was a pervasive but often unarticulated influence. You could probably find 100,000 people in the US in 1970, or maybe it was 500,000, who thought anarchism would be a good idea. It doesn't mean they read any tracts or had an ideological explanation of any kind. It was a curious sort of thing where anarchism was everywhere, but in its articulate form, not hardly anywhere at all, or only voiced through a small minority of people. It didn't play a big role in Radical America because the New Left seemed to have encompassed it in some fashion without articulating it any more than, in general, the older ideas of the left.
I guess what I thought super interesting is this, where you have this sort of unique hybrid of radical arts, history of the avant-garde, youth culture, coming together, and with Rising, is very similar to what's happening, for instance, around the same time or a little bit earlier around Provo in the Netherlands, which brings together a different set of influences into a kind of similar hybrid, even though it's several thousand miles that way.
Well, I think the movements influenced each other most certainly. In the pages of Radical America, the person who became the printer by 1970, Freddie Perlman, had been active in Paris in 1968, not as an ideological devotee of the situation. It's not at all, which made them very angry at him indeed. But he translated and illustrated Society of the Spectacle. But he had already begun to do things like that in pamphlets and activities in the US. And through him, as well as just the general publicity about the Paris and the New Left in Paris, people got a lot from them. I have to say that you had to be somebody who was a close viewer to take in the Provos. But the sense of there being really important cultural developments in Hungary, there being really important cultural developments in Czechoslovakia, every place that had something to contribute. And now I'm forgetting the anti-colonial uprisings and all that they had to contribute. So that it's a global movement in a global moment. And there was a sense of universalism. Now I'm repeating myself, but I think that the general idea is pretty clear.
Eric here from Brussels. I was wondering what is all is told. It's like, for instance, in May '68 in Paris and in other places, there was an anarchist movement, but the anarchist movement was like a very, I'm going to say old-fashioned. I don't find the right word, but it was something that didn't really was into what's happening with the young people, which was growing over there. So they were always late to react to all these things. Also in the Netherlands, what did happen was that in all these movements, there were some people that also read, of course, some of the older anarchist thinkers and writers. But in a way, it's like there was an official theory, an official organization, but everything interesting that came out of the 50s, 60s or earlier was something that came out from the bottom and not from an organization, official, organized organization. I suppose it was maybe like that too in the United States.
I think that's right. The general feeling was that all the varieties of the old left had exhausted themselves, and that something new was being created because it needed to be created, and new rules had to, rules is the wrong word, anti-rules had to emerge. And it certainly had something to do with the youth character of the movement, but it also had to do with the political explosions around the world.
And it's also something that I think it's even repeating itself with new generations that's come. You have the punk thing that happened, and you have, for instance, when there was the Occupy movement, there was like there were anarchists involved, but the really anarchist theories or the anarchist thing like that, it was something that they've discovered. Lots of people discovered that during the actions that they were doing. And it was not because of they had this anarchist mindset that they were doing the actions. It was like the other way around.
I have to say, for the older generation of ideologically minded activists who had been on the scene all the time, they rather expected they had been discovered or about to be discovered and finally understood and appreciated as they would be appreciated. And from Murray Bookchin to Irving Howe to dozens of other cultural people, like I mentioned, who are somewhere on the left, they were uniformly disappointed. Just as you suggested, the desire to find something new. And there was a bit of a generational obsession. You know, it wasn't true about people over 30. It's the most impressive to me. Two of the lead characters in my 1970s certainly are C.L.R. James and Herbert Marcuse. Now, here are people who are notable for not being one generation from the Young Radicals, but at least two generations from the Young Radicals. They had not been as defeated in the 1940s and 1950s, big generalization, but they as ancient savants, and when you saw them on stage, they looked very ancient indeed. Creaky would be the right word. But in each of these two cases, once they began to speak, they became very, very animated. In the case of James, he was ashen till he began speaking, and then the blood would flow into his face. And they articulated things that seemed to come from somewhere very distant, and yet seemed very intimate to us all watching and listening at the time. I'm sorry if that's a showstopper. There must be someplace to go from there, but I don't know of any of the two figures that had so much dramatic influence. None come to my mind anyway.
Well, I suppose you could say that James is doing a similar kind of thing with engaging with popular culture. For instance, like read his book, like his book on cricket, is an amazing demonstration of of teasing out the radical politics from a cultural form that oftentimes you wouldn't think of as being radically political.
That certainly is what it meant to us. I got him to promise in 1970 to write an essay on Willie Mays, who was his very favorite athlete in the US, who he would watch faithfully in the polo grounds in New York until he was sent to Ellis Island and could no longer see Willie Mays. But he had too many other engagements and so forth and so forth. It never really happened. His ability to put the cultural history and politics of culture together with some sentiment of what was going on in the world was crucial, was fascinating, but had an enormous amount to do with his writing of the Black Jacobins. That is, when they had the opportunity, people of color, people from global South origins would fight back. And would not be waiting to be led by white workers or white intellectuals. The opportunities didn't come up often, but Du Bois saw it during Reconstruction, and C.L.R. James went further and back in history with the rise of the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century. But that was a very big message within the 1960s, and of course it came at the same time as the Black Panthers and other kinds of activities of that kind. Beyond its anti-colonial and race limits, it was a message that people can fight back. They have their own culture that allows them to fight back. And they can reach deep inside themselves to find the things that they need, the power that they need to go against the system. And it was an enormously strengthening sort of message. I think Marcuse delivered it independently and not consistently, one might say, but still that possibility, and the possibility that it presents a new universal, was something that intellectuals thought was great, but was felt by millions of people who would never be thought of as intellectuals.
What I'd like
Well,
to... Oh, sorry.
I'd like to talk about the gallery Bugs Bunny a little bit.
Sure.
Because, we all liked Bugs Bunny. Of course, I liked Uncle Scrooge too, and the Phantom Blot was great. So, they all were big influences on us when we were kids. And Bugs Bunny especially, because he had a very anti-establishment idea. And his cartoons were wonderfully irreverent. He had a sort of psychedelic comic in the Magic Sneeze. And then the What's Opera Doc was splendid too. So when we decided to have this gallery on Eugenie Street, and that was in 1968, it opened just after the Democratic Convention, basically, later that year. And Robert Greene had found the space, and it was a very interesting space too. And he was ingenious at making these sculptures out of found objects. And so part of it was that we were using the pieces of this civilization, to put together something new. Greene was a natural sort of thinker on an anarchist way, and he was able to bring together all sorts of different things. He made a machine that had a motorcycle face and a wheel and a classic sculptural face in the window of the motorcycle. So we had the gallery on Eugenie Street, and there was a couple of shows there. Basically, people flocked to it. They wanted to see what other young people were doing. We got good coverage in the newspaper from the Sun-Times and the Tribune. Greene put out a little leaflet against the Art Institute, which actually brought people over to our small gallery. So basically it worked. It was there for a few years. We held 3 or 4 shows. One was for Schlechter Duval. One was on movement posters. Another was a small Franklin Rosemont exhibit. I don't know quite why we moved out of that space. Probably they raised the rent because it was an especially good one. People loved popular culture. It was something that brought them together. And I think their love of Bugs Bunny brought them to the gallery. We had no sign on the door but a painting of Bugs Bunny and some weird sculptural stuff in the windows. So I think that was a good thing. We were able to get people over to our bookstore also, where they were influenced by books by Lawrence Ferlinghetti and City Lights. So it was basically a very lively time. People were looking for something to do. They didn't know quite what the Democratic Convention meant. They weren't quite sure what to do next, but they were drawn to getting together and trying to find a way. And I think that was one of the great things about the 60s, that people were trying to explore new things.
I really like the way that Bugs appears multiple times through the book. For instance, he'll appear the as the resolution of dialectical tensions, or and Frank will have this way which he'll make an argument which will be so absurd that it's wonderful. So I'll just read one because I really love it. Okay, this quote here, he says, "For me, a single Bugs Bunny comic of the early 1950s, such as The Magic Sneeze, like you mentioned, Penny, will always be worth more in terms of freedom and human dignity than all the novels of Proust, Sartre, Faulkner, and Hemingway." Such
Good
a
quote.
judgment, which will probably strike some as excessive, a little bit, possesses at least the virtue of complete seriousness. And I love it because it's like it's so over the top. It's almost a way you can't take it's like even just trying to think that through seriously is kind of humorous but wonderful and magical, and maybe that's what attracted people to your gallery, because they almost sense the sort of like the wondrousness of Bugs as character and all these things that come with it, and then you almost kind of just like unpacking the magic or playing with the magic.
Yeah, and of course, Scrooge McDuck was interesting
When
also because he got himself into the greatest predicament, and and have to figure out some way of saving things. I do remember one time it was the Tra La La was the country, and they found a bottle cap.
Right.
And they thought, oh, this is the only bottle cap in Tra La La. Now I'm the richest man here. So they thought, well, the solution will be to drop a plane load of bottle caps on the country. And of course, it polluted the water, it stopped the spring, everybody. And Scrooge had to figure out a way to stop this nonsense. But it shows how small things, which are valued too highly, or the wrong thing, which is valued too highly, can make a horrible difference in society.
Thousands and thousands, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of us individually read that comic when it appeared, that scary story, and it is vivid in my mind. I never saw it again, but it is as vivid in my mind as it is in Penny's. It made such
Oh, okay, great.
enormous impact on us, which only shows the power of certain elements of popular culture.
But I love that how just as you have the sort of the magic and power of Bugs Bunny, you have the sort of like the reactionary horror of Elmer Fudd as the petite bourgeois constantly trying to reinforce property relations. Um, and I
Yeah.
love it because you could take a very sort of abstract philosophical concept or series of them and render it into a delightful, funny way of putting it.
Yeah, actually, I have a question for Paul. The cover of the first cultural correspondence, the journal you did with David Wagner is from 1975. So that has Bugs on the cover at a typewriter. And so that's actually the year before the Marvelous Freedom exhibition, Penny, just to extend your thought on exhibitions in Chicago, that the Chicago group put on this huge exhibition, which had a whole Bugs Bunny sort of, it was like Bugs Bunny was like at the core of that exhibition. But so why, Paul, like what was the decision to put Bugs on the cover? Was there any like Franklin connection there with that first cover of CC?
It was not my decision. It was the decision of Dave Wagner, who was about to lead the major newspaper strike in Wisconsin in the 1970s and be blacklisted for leading the strike. And it's simply reflected because we talked about Bugs Bunny and the comics and so forth. It had been in our own mutual childhoods. Had it been somehow suggested in the surrealist issue of Radical America, I don't think that we would have been conscious of that. But I have no doubt that the seed was planted. And if you were going to publish a journal, it was a very thin, badly printed first several years magazine, struggling to get it to find a readership of a few hundred and then a few thousand, barely surviving issue by issue. If you were going to publish a magazine of some kind that, as we said at the time, turned the dialectics of Theodor Adorno and the Frankfurt School upside down, accepted the dialectics, and in a way that the finality of Theodor Adorno's judgments on modern culture, modern commercial culture, but then strove to turn them upside down. What would be the most decisive image for that? Well, it would probably be Bugs Bunny at a typewriter, since we didn't yet have computers. So it wasn't my insight.
You got to make this connection.
Big Wagner suggested it seemed terribly obvious. Or we found out about Tex Avery's connection with Hollywood left, part of a world of left nationists.
Yeah. And you got to make the connection with Sebastian. Sebastian plays chess.
Penny, you guys might want to mute your computer really quick so we can, because we can hear you chatting. Just while you're chatting. Okay. Yeah. Well, I don't know, Stephen, if you noticed this in the book, but quite a few of the texts that are Franklin's texts that we chose were from his special issue of Paul and Dave's cultural correspondence from 79, Surrealism and its popular accomplices, which is, if everybody doesn't have a copy of that, you should get one. It is, for me, online. That's like, yeah, there you can get them. Yeah, you can still get them. It's such an important moment. And that's where, like, because in Radical America, it's like Franklin is really highlighting surrealism. It's not so much about popular culture, but where the minds of Paul Buhle and Penny Rosemont and Franklin Rosemont really start to congeal for me is in that CC issue. And in other places in the late 70s, but it's interesting to kind of see that development from the late 60s into the late 70s, and in terms of their shared thinking.
Yeah, if I hold up this issue of cultural correspondence that Franklin edited, it's also wonderfully, wonderfully illustrated. So it's very much worth finding it online. I then go on to the 1982 issue of Radical America, that is a 15 years anniversary issue, which I selected out of those 15 years. You find some really strong and fascinating connections of the social movements as we saw them at the time, and the kind of writers who were interested in culture and left-wing politics, who were sort of beyond the old hard lines of Marxist socialism, anarchism, and so forth, but very much within the struggle, and at that moment, tremendously creative.
Well, I mean, one of the things I find interesting is you get, I guess, particular moments or times where you get these new kinds of recombinations. And one example of that to bring in a little bit is places like, for instance, earlier, like the dill pickle, right? One of the things I find interesting comes across in the dill pickle essay or two essays is oftentimes if you're talking about the sort of attempt to bring together Marx and Freud, that's thought of as something coming about in the 60s. But there's one great line of something like the Wobblies and the Dill Picklers were trying to combine Marx and Freud like 50 years earlier, right? So here you have sort of, you know, the kinds of combinations that become possible with those kinds of spaces of encounter where you get, you know, the IWW meeting, you know, Ben Reitman meeting, you know, avant-garde poets, meeting these other people, and what happens when these people sort of come together.
trying to unmute myself here. Okay, and that's where you can circle back to, you know, Penny and Franklin's background in Chicago, especially Franklin's background. You know, his dad is a part of the typesetters union. You know, mom is involved in music, and you know, Penny and Franklin both separately, and I won't speak for you, Penny, but they're discovering surrealism through school by accident, you know, and kind of partly through the Beats at the same time, separately. And so it's just this, like, I don't know, it's the texture of lived life. You know, you can't plan that or imitate it. It just was it was something that was possible in that time and place. It's quite unique autobiographically, and so I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Penny, like you did already, kind of the richness of Chicago, and you know, when you come to Roosevelt University, all that spilling over and meeting the radical leftist politics that are becoming so important to you both in the early 60s. You're muted.
Is that better? Yes? Okay. Well, I don't know. You know, I think we were products of our times in a way. There was a lot going on before we got to Roosevelt. Actually, Franklin and Larry were just getting back from Mexico City, where they had met Leonora Carrington. So surrealism was becoming part of our presence. And although we had discovered it independently earlier on, we hadn't any idea that it still existed, that there were still people who met in the cafes, and that Andre Breton was actually still alive and doing a publication, La Brèche. So, you know, it was a big discovery for us. And we were, of course, very pleased about that. And the older surrealists, of course, had tried to be part of their times. They weren't ivory tower artists. They commented on the politics of their times. They tried to be involved. They tried to be on the right side when it turns out the communists were dominated by Stalin. They left immediately. And they just basically tried to be progressive in their views and to make them known to everyone else. I think they're probably the most famous group of artists for putting out little manifestos on one thing or another that they didn't like. Some of my favorite are in defense of the women. For instance, Violet Notzier, who murdered her parents, or tried. In any case, she murdered her father. I think her mother survived. But she was a teenager that everybody hated, except for the surrealists. They were sympathetic. They understood what she'd gone through. And later there was a book written on her, and it pointed out that she was a subject of sexual abuse by her father. And she was definitely a teenager who was maltreated. She basically just wanted to go out and be with young people, and they wouldn't even let her do that. So she decided to poison them. Oh, well. Who would defend a person like that? Well, the surrealists did. They loved a good scandal if they could find one. So we were sort of inspired by that. It was a terrible time in a sense that Franklin's brother and some of my relatives had been off in the Korean War. And that had just seemed to have come to a stalemate when Vietnam came up. And none of the young people that I know wanted to go to Vietnam. They just didn't want to go. I mean, it was on the other side of the world. It just seemed like a tremendous sacrifice to go there. And they weren't really sure that there was any reason for it. So people were quite perplexed by it. And it became more and more a factor in organizing people. And it was a very central factor So we weren't arguing over a lot of other questions. We were all basically against that war. And we were in support of the civil rights movement. We were some of the first kids who grew up in integrated situations. We had Black friends. We met them at the university. It looked like the world was changing. And in fact, it was. And in fact, it did. The problem is, of course, to sustain a change in a time now when so many other factors are interceding. The technology has changed the way we think. It's changed the demands on people. Transportation by airplane has become extremely common. All of the little railroad towns are being destroyed. Basically, either superhighways or airports are taking their place. And so there's really serious social changes that we have to figure out answers to and some way to involve, and protect everyone in a situation like this where the very things that they've come to expect, like Social Security for older people and medical care and free speech, are somewhat threatened. So, it's a new world we didn't expect quite this way, but somehow we have to deal with it.
One of the things that I didn't realize until reading this book is that the Chicago Surrealists were the first people to exhibit the work of Henry Darger. I'm just curious, how did that come about?
Well, that was one of the many things that happened by chance in life, and it was so odd. He apparently lived about a half block from where we met at Roma's, but we didn't know him. But Clarence John Loughlin from New Orleans knew about him, and he knew about him through the person who used to order surrealist books at Crocs and Brentano's. He was Henry Tabor, and he was very interested in surrealism. He was an older guy. He ordered all kinds of surrealist books. So it was interesting. They were available to us right there at the bookstore downtown, thanks to Henry Tabor. And of course, the paintings were at the Art Institute. So Tabor kept up on these things, and he knew of Lee Godey, and he knew of Henry Darger, and he told Clarence about them. So Clarence went over to visit the other photographer, Nathan Lerner, because Nathan had bought the house that Darger was living in. And he had no idea until Darger died that he was producing these things. And so he had this wonderful room full of, a tiny room full of giant drawings, smaller drawings, an enormous book that Darger had been writing for years. And it was fabulous. He wanted to donate the whole thing to the museum in Switzerland, but they wouldn't take it. So about this time, when the room was still there, Clarence came into town and he took Franklin over there. Nathan showed him the room and everything. So we got to know Nathan Lerner. And then he said, "Do you want to take these two monster pictures?" They were sort of dragons that Darger had created. And so we put them in a show that we had in Gary, Indiana. So Darger's first appearance was not at our World Surrealist exhibition, which we would have really loved, but in a follow-up one in Gary. But we were very pleased to have that. The worst thing about it is I wanted those pictures, and Nathan wouldn't give them to me.
Oh, did you?
So
Who the fuck did dipshit?
And there was the entrance of the absurd.
what?
Sorry, not important.
Terry, you might want to mute your background there. We can hear you guys. Nice to see you here. It's Terry Engel. Paul, of anyone I know in the world, is the most passionate person about comics. And we talk about that a lot. And I guess, Paul, I just wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more to why you wanted to do the volume, and like how that relates to your own passion for comics and popular culture in general. Vernacular culture really is a better word in some ways.
Let me try to be cogent. For a lot of people who were born in the mid-1940s, the discovery of Mad Comics, not Mad Magazine, which comes only in 1956, but Mad Comics, 1953 to 55, was really far more socially critical and in a way artistically violent and satirical and so forth. That they were reprinted from a comic into 4 paperback volumes with the comic pages done in black and white and terribly reduced on a paperback book page. But still, for many of us, those 4 volumes of reprints from Mad Comics were opened our and to a way of the world savage subjects seen through the eyes of these Jewish guys from the Bronx, some of whose parents had been communists. At any rate, 1969, 1970, I find myself issue by issue trying to do something with Radical America, and the new genre emerging from the underground press was underground comics that I can't take time to describe here, but Radical America comics appeared in 1969, about the same time as Surrealism, was an effective putting together of anti-war and pro-marijuana material in comic form. So that was a phenomenon. It sold 30,000 copies. We have to go down to the 1990s when comics are accepted as a legitimate art form. Commercial distributors are starting to pick them up. And I'm writing about comic art in the Nation and the Village Voice and so forth. Not suddenly it's 2003, and someone reminds me that the anniversary of the Industrial Workers of the World, the centenary of the world, is only 2 years away in 2005. So I contacted a whole bunch of people, found a financial backer who was selling marijuana, I later learned, and we published Wobblies that really epitomized what a radical comic can succeed to do. And I might say I responded Franklin Rosemont's challenge in the Joe Hill book, that whereas I had praised the Wobblies, I hadn't written a chapter about them in my book, Marxism in the US. This was my vindication or his vindication. Much more pictorial, interesting form than any system. Write in prose.
Okay, now look at the system.
A really valuable book to see and widely used. That becomes the first of about 20 graphic novels that I edited about very
no.
in the U.S. and the international left. Are you trying to tell me something?
Keep going. It's cool.
And I hope I've responded adequately to Abigail, but the work on radical comics that goes on today, working with a large variety of artists on many themes, is to me consistent with what we were learning and teaching ourselves to do in the late 1960s and 70s, and a reflection on what comic books and comic art meant to us from those days, from our childhood days.
So maybe what I'll do is I'll throw out one more question for maybe as a sort of nudging towards a conclusion or sort of
Yeah,
a conversation for this evening. One of the things I think you could say it could sort of brings together a lot of the texts across this book and a lot of the work of Chicago surrealists and people at the time is the idea of trying to defend or not maybe not defend, almost like trace out and go with the poetic spirit and find, and enjoy the moment of the poetic spirit, whether it's through free jazz, whether it's through the wonders of Bugs Bunny, whether it's through the powers of surrealism, but trying to sort of like constantly like tap into and keep going the sort of I think the phrase that's used later in the book is almost to like to restore poetry to its poetic form as a kind of making, which is not necessarily even poetry, but it's kind of like a poetry of everyday life. And so I guess what maybe to nudge to let's say not a conclusion, but a sort of stopping is, can we think about if we're looking at this period of history, at this time in these publications, what do you think we can draw from the poetic spirit in trying to keep alive the poetic spirit for today, for now, in a time where times seem pretty bleak, right? So I think that we need that kind of that poetic "What's up, Doc" energy more than ever. So that's my sort of. I'll throw that out. And again, Penny, I muted you not because I want to actually mute you, but just because I was trying to cut out some of the background noise. So when you're ready, if you could unmute yourself, that'd be cool.
Paul, will you go first?
Okay, I guess I've unmuted myself,
Excellent.
but I think I have to get going. So it's been lovely, and I am looking, I love the book. It turned out wonderfully. So, I'll be looking forward to reading it, rereading it again, because I really, I don't get tired of our own stuff, sadly. I can just keep reading it. And so I'll see you all again soon. Thanks for doing this.
Bye, Penny. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Penny.
Paul, you go. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Paul, or?
I guess all I want to say, and for me it's also a wrap up, is that this book wouldn't have happened without the inspiration of Abigail and her stick-to-itiveness with finding this stuff, making sense of it for today, and trying to think of how it can be useful for today's readers. A whole lot of work has been done on the history of the cultural left, some of the greatest work by Alan Wald, and a little piece of work by myself and others on the films of the blacklisted screenwriters, and across the old left political lines, communist to Trotskyist to anarchist, a tremendous amount of energy emerging toward the middle and end of the 1940s that was stopped cold by the blacklist and McCarthyism, but resurged in the 1960s and 1970s, and is never very far away. And if I'm not mistaken, is near the surface again today, because it has to be. That's the completion of what I want to say.
Excellent. Well, sometimes it's good to have an industrious art historian. Actually, always. Sometimes it's good to have an enterprising cannabis dealer who's willing to fund a publication. And it's how all these things come together in the right ways that makes the magic.
Very good.
Of course, is being way too modest, because the whole book was Paul's idea. Because the way I see it, if I may, as Paul's friend, is Paul's trying to grasp the this kind of intensity of this friendship with Franklin, which was sometimes combative, right? And it wasn't always easy. And we won't go into that, but there's like this synergy that they have that's like incredible when it comes to Paul and Franklin. I mean, this question of popular culture, it runs deep, and obviously the leftist politics is there too, but there's a kind of, in some ways those vectors separate, right? and especially when it comes to surrealism, like that's the other end of the triangle. Like the surrealist triangle doesn't really always connect with what Paul was doing and Paul was interested in. And so, you know, as a historian, of course, I like to sort of try to solve the riddle. And in the process of doing that, Paul and I have become friends, and I've listened to Paul and understanding that there's really something important here to try to pull together in a kind of easy, portable way for readers, you know, that you don't have to buy the entire library of everything Franklin did, or the obscure surrealist publications or the radical publications. You know, you have it in this like beautiful little book, and PM Press collaborated with us in that way too. It was, the whole thing was along the line of friendship project with Penny's help, Kerr Books as well, Tamara Smith there, and Ramsey Kanan at PM. And so there's a larger thing here, kind of like also the, not the remnants of a lifetime of friendship, but also like its results, you know, and how that has branched out into the present day. But to try to answer your question, Stephen, like this is why for me, Paul has helped me try to push back my kind of just like my obsession with the political and the historical, and to try to give some room to the popular. You know, I have a book on surrealism and animation coming out, which I think speaks to that, what I've learned from Paul. And it's really challenging. Like I kind of still hold them apart in my mind, you know, like right now I have almost no sense of humor because of how bleak things are. Like this conversation really cheers me up. And I don't know, with what we're facing right now, how what might be called the imagination or humor or vernacular culture might come back in or help us. But of course, it's going to still be there. It's still going to fulminate from the people around the world, right, in different contexts. So if nothing, you know, I think we can say, you know, where there is life, there will be these petri dishes of cultures that are about how life exceeds capital, you know. So I think there's something there that is hopeful. And in our spare moments of grieving, maybe we can look to the sort of these popular pasts with an eye to the future. I would actually be curious to hear what you would say, Stephen, in this moment. Like where is popular culture for you right now?
That's a complicated question, and I'm going to dodge it artfully. But what I will say is maybe we'll do this as a conclusion. Maybe to paraphrase Brecht, will there be jokes about in these dark times? Yes, there will be jokes about the dark times, and I think the jokes are the things that keep us alive.
Indeed.
Or maybe to have a nice conclusion. I can't do the voice, but I would say, that's all, folks.
Okay, thanks very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Paul. Bye,
I
Stephen.
just want to add, I'm not sure that most of you are left.